While the whole world is distracted by Iran, China has launched an open military operation against Taiwan. Beijing is steadily increasing pressure on Taiwan's outlying islands, turning what used to be occasional patrols into systematic and almost constant military activity. The point is that China has effectively already seized the small islands around Taiwan and is getting as close as possible to Taipei itself. And now analysts are saying that China has followed Iran's example and realized that the US won't be able to resist the takeover. The so-called Hormuz scenario in the Taiwan Strait would provoke even more serious consequences for the global economy than the current crisis, which is why China is ready to implement it. Iran didn't need to sink a single tanker to stop a fifth of the world's oil supplies. Just a few missile strikes were enough, and drone attacks to convince companies to refuse to insure ships passing through the Hormuz Strait. In just a few days, this critically important energy hub was effectively blocked. Right now, the market still refuses to take on such a risk. This scenario could be repeated. China is a more powerful player than Iran and can use a more sophisticated version of the same economic blackmail in the Taiwan Strait. I'm Alexei Pichi, let's discuss this together. But before we start this episode, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video. So, I'll start with the latest news around Taiwan, which isn't being talked about much right now because all the attention is focused on Iran. China has started actively seizing Taiwan's small islands using hybrid tactics. A telling example is the area around Pratas Island in the South China Sea. And if, during the pre-war period in Ukraine in 2021, the presence of Chinese forces there was not recorded at all, today it has increased to 60 days. Patrols per year involving dozens of different ships from the Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Administration. At the same time, both the frequency and the nature of the operation have changed, moving beyond simply being present in the contiguous zone to regular entries directly into territorial waters. And already at the beginning of 2026, several new so-called military patrols were recorded, which indicates the consolidation of this practice. In other words, the point is to gradually accustom Taiwan and the entire international community to the fact that the small islands are already under China's control. Whether you like it or not, but Pratas is just one element of a broader strategy. The thing is, the activity of the islands is synchronized with the exercises of the China's People's Liberation Army. It is accompanied by drone incursions and reinforced by Beijing's official rhetoric about normalizing such patrols and increasing control in sensitive areas. This way, a new model of pressure is being formed. In other words, these are not sudden escalations but a gradual increase in presence, which kind of erodes the status quo and creates de facto control over the so-called disputed waters. So in fact, after some time passes, everyone will just get used to the idea that, oh yes, the Chinese control everything there. In the long term, this allows China to expand its operational space and test the reaction of Taiwan and its allies. And on this topic today, the Financial Times writes that China could easily adopt Iran's tactics. The so-called Hormuz scenario easily fits into China's war against Taiwan. Iran didn't need to sink a single tanker to stop 1/5 of the world's oil supplies. A few missile strikes and a few drone attacks were enough to convince companies to refuse to insure ships passing through the Hormuz Strait. And in just a matter of days, this critically important energy hub was effectively blocked. And as you know, Trump said, have the courage, go through the strait. Some tried, and we saw footage of a burning tanker. China is still a more powerful player in this situation than Iran, and it can use a similar but more sophisticated tactic in the Taiwan Strait. Tehran's strategy is economic exhaustion. Iran is counting on the fact that the US won't be able to tolerate high oil prices forever, and eventually they will back down. If and when that happens, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps will continue to control the Hormuz Strait. Oil shipments through this key waterway will resume, but only when Tehran allows it or for an appropriate price. Beijing has the means to implement such a strategy without actually firing on merchant ships. The crisis around Taiwan could begin with a unilateral legal declaration. That is, China could declare its right to control who arrives at and who leaves the island. Beijing could demonstrate its resolve by launching missiles, opening fire, and declaring exclusion zones in the Taiwan Strait. Even without open war, if the risk of escalation seems high, private carriers, tankers, and ships will feel pressure and will try to avoid the waters and airspace around Taiwan. If it's hard to convince a shipping company to resume routes with several Iranian drones in the area, then imagine what would happen if those same companies were asked to send their tankers through areas where the People's Liberation Army of China is operating. So it's obvious that these companies will most likely refuse. And this attempt to establish the presence of so-called patrols on the small islands around Taiwan is exactly the same tactic. So in fact, the Chinese are gradually, slowly but surely filling the South China Sea with their military, so they can eventually claim control over all these waters. And as the Financial Times writes, Washington will have to make a choice. To accept the new norm in which Beijing de facto controls Taiwan's trade, including the island's microchip manufacturing enterprise, or risk escalating to an open economic war and possibly even a direct military conflict. Even if a real war can be avoided, the macroeconomic and financial shock from such a crisis over Taiwan could be significantly greater than what is happening today as a result of the escalation in the Persian Gulf. The countries that are suffering now will be the ones to suffer the most. One can imagine a situation where China tries to establish indirect control over Taiwan's trade. The US and its allies still try to supply the island with the necessary goods, challenging Beijing. But China might not even have to use military force to block all these shipments. Beijing can simply put pressure on them or threaten to use force. If trade flows around Taiwan are physically disrupted, the energy shock for regional economies will be much stronger than it is today. Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea could lose the ability to buy energy shipments at any price because no one would be able to deliver them. All three countries could be left without deliveries. Той же нефти и сжиженного газа. In addition, a number of global industries from electronics to automotive manufacturing would come to a halt. Because the Taiwanese company TSMC produces more than 90% of the world's most advanced microchips. There are no strategic reserves of semiconductors. The TSMC plant in Arizona in the States won't be able to easily replace all the lost supplies. And in the event of a shortage, the government of Taiwan may introduce energy rationing for industry. Or when faced with a blockade, Taiwan might cut back on chip production to put pressure on the world in order to secure its own supplies. Like, you want chips? Then help us. Today, the booming export of microchips helps protect the economies of Taiwan and South Korea from the current shock of energy prices. In the event of a crisis in Taiwan, the supply of microchips itself would be at risk. Well, there wouldn't be any point in restricting the operation of energy-intensive chip manufacturing plants. A shock in semiconductor supplies will worsen economic and financial difficulties and could trigger panic in the stock markets, especially in the American technology sector, which, as you understand, threatens the rapid spread of a financial crisis around the world. Accordingly, Beijing's strategy, like Iran's current strategy, may be to try to convince убедить США. As you understand, Beijing, with its significant reserves, may be more resilient than a coalition of democracies with smaller reserves. China is currently stockpiling huge reserves of oil, microchips, grain, and a whole range of other goods, by the way. So is China really preparing for something? The purpose of creating a shadow fortress economy is precisely so that it doesn't have to be used. The US and its allies now need their own mechanisms for joint stockpiling, pre-established crisis logistics, and a permanent structure for managing economic crises. It will take time to create this, and such an approach should be tested before a crisis occurs, not improvised during one, as is happening now. In the event of any crisis around Taiwan, the top priority, even before imposing sanctions against China or supply chain disruptions, will be managing the global economic consequences. Therefore, it is clear that the current war in the Middle East will bring certain lessons to both sides. China is drawing its own conclusions. He understands perfectly well that, as it turns out, a blockade actually works quite effectively. Well, the West needs to draw its own conclusions about how to prepare for such scenarios and what to do about them. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, I would appreciate it. You can do this with any donation, paid subscription, or sponsorship. Links and payment details are in the description of this video. It says there, support Alexei Pechei's channel. Choose any format that's convenient for you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.